Did you know Argentina was once among the top 10 richest countries in the world by per capita income? Let's dive into the fascinating history of Argentina.
Hey there, I'm Garrett, feeling pretty curious today and ready to explore Argentina's rich history.
And I'm Leah, excited to unpack the intriguing details of Argentina with you. Welcome to Laid Back Learning with Leah and Garrett.
Today's topic is Argentina, a nation with a captivating blend of history, culture, and politics that has shaped a very distinct identity in the world.
I remember reading about Argentina's economic boom in the early 1900s and just stopping in my tracks. Around 1908, it ranked 7th globally by per capita income, even surpassing places like Denmark and Canada. That's so wild. Then you look at the turbulent later decades, the inflation cycles, the 2001-2002 collapse, and you feel this whiplash. I kept thinking about the families who lived through both the heyday and the hard years, and how memory travels from grandparents to grandkids. It made me curious about the deeper patterns behind those swings.
All right, let's set the stage for this one. Argentina, officially the Argentine Republic, sits in the southern cone of South America. It's the second largest country on the continent after Brazil and the 8th largest in the world. Picture the Andes running down the west, the fertile Pampas in the center, and Patagonia stretching toward the sub-Antarctic south. Its southern tip reaches toward Antarctica via the Drake Passage, which is that stormy sea lane between South America and Antarctica that sailors trade both stories and respect for.
Speaking of geography, it links to a lot of neighbors. Chile along the west, Bolivia and Paraguay up north, Brazil to the northeast, Uruguay and the Atlantic Ocean on the east. Politically, it's a federal state with 23 provinces plus the autonomous city of Buenos Aires as the capital. Each province has its own constitution, kind of like local rule books under the national one. That federal setup reflects those long 19th century debates over central power versus provincial autonomy. On development, it's a developing country, but with one of the region's higher Human Development Index scores, only behind Chile in Latin America. Still, the macroeconomy has this on-again, off-again habit with inflation and recession that keeps policymakers on their toes.
Name-wise, here's a cool detail. Argentina comes from the Latin word argentum, meaning silver. Early Europeans chased legends of silver mountains in the La Plata basin. La Plata literally means silver in Spanish. The label stuck in poetry and maps before it was cemented in official documents. You'll also see older English references to the country as the Argentine, which sounds vintage newspaper chic. And the place has very deep human roots. Archaeology in Patagonia's Cueva de las Manos, the Cave of the Hands, shows rock art going back thousands of years. Even near Buenos Aires, there's evidence of humans butchering megafauna about 21,000 years ago, during the last glacial maximum, which is just a cold peak of the last ice age.
And before the Spanish arrived, there was a mosaic of societies. In the far south, groups like the Selknam and Yagan were hunter-gatherers without pottery. In the center and north, peoples like the Tehuelche, Com, and Huichi were advanced hunter-gatherers. Then you had farmers with pottery like the Diaguita in the northwest and the Guarani in the northeast. Around the late 1400s, the Inca Empire extended into what's now northwest Argentina, influencing the Diaguita and the Huarpe. That Andean connection becomes crucial later when independence leaders crisscross those mountain passes.
Speaking of crisscrossing, early on, Buenos Aires repelled 2 British invasions in 1806 and 1807. That local militia spirit fed the May Revolution in 1810, when a local governing junta replaced the Spanish viceroy. By 1816, at the Congress of Tucumán, independence was declared. Then generals José de San Martín of Argentina and Bernardo O'Higgins of Chile made that legendary Andes crossing in 1817, helping secure Chilean independence and pushing toward Peru. Martín Miguel de Güemes, who led militias in the northwest, kept royalist forces at bay and protected the rear. Those campaigns are like the Southern Cone's road movie, but with high altitude and no guardrails.
After independence, there were fierce tug-of-wars over how to organize the state. Names changed a few times. In 1826, a constitution used Argentine Republic, but it didn't stick politically. In 1853, the Argentine Confederation name came with a federal charter spearheaded by Justo José de Urquiza, who had overthrown the strongman Juan Manuel de Rosas. Buenos Aires left and then rejoined, and by 1860, a decree settled again on Argentine Republic, with a constitutional amendment recognizing the multiple names used since 1810. After the 1861 Battle of Pavón, Bartolomé Mitre became president of a reunified country. He was followed by Domingo Sarmiento and Nicolás Avellaneda, and that era really built schools and railways. There's a darker piece, too. The conquest of the desert in the late 1870s and early 1880s, a military campaign that seized indigenous lands in the Pampas and Patagonia and redistributed them to large landholders. It reshaped the map and left a hard legacy for indigenous communities.
Then comes the boom. From roughly 1870 to 1910, the population surged. Exports like wheat and chilled beef took off, and rail lines stitched the territory together. Buenos Aires became this cosmopolitan magnet for European immigrants. By 1908, per capita income ranked among the top 10 globally. That's pretty cool, right? But here's the catch. The model leaned heavily on primary exports and foreign capital. When global markets hiccup, the engine sputters. Why did it boom then? You had high world demand, huge land frontiers, inbound investment, and new tech like refrigeration that made Argentine beef a global dinner guest. The vulnerabilities were slower industrial diversification and exposure to external price shocks.
Political participation opened up in 1912 with the Sáenz-Peña Law, bringing universal and secret male suffrage that undercut the old elite machine. In 1916, Hipólito Yrigoyen from the Radical Civic Union, the UCR, won the presidency and pushed social reforms. Argentina stayed neutral in World War I, which preserved trade but sparked internal debates about alignment. The economy had started to industrialize in the 1920s, but it was uneven, and the Great Depression hit hard. That pain set the stage for the first modern military coup in 1930, and what's called the infamous decade began with electoral fraud and recurring interventions.
World War II added another twist. Argentina stayed neutral for most of it, a stance that Britain tolerated for trade reasons, but that the United States opposed after Pearl Harbor. In 1945, Argentina finally declared war on the Axis, basically at the finish line. Inside the military, a 1943 coup had already shaken things up, and an officer named Juan Perón rose fast. Perón is key. Peronism, or justicialism, is a broad movement around labor rights, social justice, and nationalism. He won the 1946 election, expanded welfare, raised wages, and nationalized strategic sectors. In 1947, he pushed through women's suffrage. His wife, Eva Perón, known as Evita, became an icon of social assistance and working-class dignity. But by the early 1950s, growth slowed and tensions grew. In 1955, the Argentine Navy bombed the Plaza de Mayo in Buenos Aires during an uprising, civilian casualties and all. Later that year, Perón was ousted and went into exile in Spain.
The next decades were turbulent. President Arturo Frondizi, elected in 1958, tried to draw in investment and end the ban on Peronism, but he was toppled in 1962. Arturo Illia governed from 1963 to 1966 with decent economic results, but faced another coup. In 1966, the so-called Argentine Revolution shut down Congress, banned parties, and sought to depoliticize society. Students and workers answered in 1969 with mass protests like the Cordobazo. Two guerrilla groups stepped into that storm, the Montoneros, a Peronist left urban guerrilla, and the ERP, the People's Revolutionary Army, a Marxist group that also tried rural insurgency. In 1973, Héctor Campora, a Peronist stand-in, briefly took office, amnestied militants, and Perón returned. But the movement was split. The Ezeiza massacre on Perón's return day in June 1973 showed how bitter that divide was. A far-right group called the AAA, the Argentine Anti-Communist Alliance, began terror attacks on leftists. Perón won again in late 1973 with his wife Isabel as vice president, then died in 1974. Under Isabel, a 1975 decree launched Operativo Independencia to crush the ERP in Tucumán, and security forces expanded counterinsurgency tactics.
In March 1976, the military seized power and started the national reorganization process, the last dictatorship. That's the heart of what's often called the Dirty War, a period of state terrorism. Forced disappearances, torture, and clandestine detention centers operated across the country. Estimates of victims vary, often between about 15 and 30,000 disappeared or killed by state forces. Guerrilla violence also caused casualties, including roughly 500 to 540 military and police victims and up to around 230 civilian victims. The regime coordinated with neighboring dictatorships through Operation Condor, which was a transnational repression network across the Southern Cone. Then in 1982, the junta invaded the Falkland Islands, or Islas Malvinas, as Argentina calls them. After a short but intense conflict with the United Kingdom, Argentina surrendered. The defeat delegitimized the regime and sped up the return to civilian rule.
Democracy returned in 1983 with Raúl Alfonsín. He launched the trial of the juntas to prosecute top commanders. Under pressure, he later backed laws that halted broader prosecutions known as full stop and due obedience, and then hyperinflation battered the economy. In 1989, Carlos Menem won and applied neoliberal policies, meaning market-oriented steps like privatizations and a fixed exchange rate. Early stability gave way to rising unemployment and vulnerability. By late 2001 and 2002, Argentina's model imploded. The government froze bank withdrawals, protests erupted, and there were rapid leadership changes. In 2003, Nestor Kirchner took office, used neo-Keynesian policies, basically state spending to support demand, restructured debt with steep haircuts, and paid off IMF obligations. He also helped restart human rights trials by undoing those amnesty shields.
Cristina Fernández de Kirchner followed in 2007 and 2011. Relations with the US and UK were sometimes tense, while ties with Venezuela, Iran, and Cuba drew attention. Growth cooled after 2011. In 2015, Mauricio Macri won, pushed austerity to fight inflation and deficits. By the end of his term, inflation was still high, GDP had shrunk overall, and poverty had risen. In 2019, Alberto Fernandez took office with Cristina as vice president, then navigated the pandemic in tough negotiations. In 2021, the ruling coalition lost its Senate majority. In 2023, an outsider libertarian economist, Javier Milei, won the presidency, promising radical spending cuts and market liberalization. He took office in December 2023, and in 2025, his party, La Libertad Avanza, scored big in midterms, easing passage of reforms. Through it all, Argentina kept an international profile as a founding member of the UN and the WTO, part of the G20, and a founding member of Mercosur, the South American trade bloc. It's also a major non-NATO ally of the United States. And the sovereignty claim over the Falklands or Malvinas remains a constant plank in foreign policy.
There's also this intriguing global footnote. An Argentine corsair named Hippolyte Bouchard, a privateer fighting for independence, raided Spanish holdings from California to the Philippines. He even received recognition from King Kamehameha I of Hawaii. Some historians, like Pacho O'Donnell, argue Hawaii might have been the first state to recognize Argentine independence. Records are spotty, so it's debated, but it shows how independence politics leaped oceans. Why would Hawaii be first? Because Kamehameha was building his own international standing and saw opportunity in trading and aligning with new actors who weren't Spain.
So where does that leave the big picture? A country that swung from early 20th century prosperity to periods of volatility, that created a durable mass movement in Peronism, and that put human rights on the map after 1983. It bridges the Andes, the Atlantic, and even a slice of the Antarctic. And Buenos Aires still feels like a cultural engine room for the region.
Let's get to a tough and important question. When did the Dirty War really start, and how many victims were there? Both are debated. The common framing is 1976 to 1983, the dictatorship years, but there were earlier signals. The 1973 activity of the Triple-A, that far-right death squad, and the 1975 annihilation decrees against insurgents were already unleashing state violence. Victim numbers also vary. Many sources cite between about 15 and 30,000 disappeared or killed by state forces, and guerrilla violence left hundreds of military and police dead and some civilian victims. For legal clarity, I lean toward 1976 as the start because the coup created a centralized, clandestine system. Courts, reparations, and historical memory policies often need that precise anchor.
I hear you on the legal anchor, but I'd widen the lens a bit. If we mark only 1976, we risk missing the state's responsibility under a civilian presidency for 1975's Operativo Independencia and the earlier AAA links to parts of the security apparatus. Recognizing those as part of the arc, even if pre-coup, spreads accountability across institutions and timelines. It helps us understand how a culture of impunity and clandestine methods was already brewing. For memory, that matters, because the ramp-up normalized practices that the dictatorship then industrialized.
So maybe the way through is a layered timeline, a prelude phase in 1973 to 1975 where paramilitary and early state actions escalated, then a formalized machinery of terror from 1976 to 1983 under the junta. That preserves legal clarity while acknowledging continuity. It also respects victims whose suffering began before the tanks rolled in. Real talk, whatever the start date, the imperative is truth, justice, and non-repetition.
Yeah, that checks out and explains why trials later resumed after the 2000s once those amnesty shields were lifted. It gave the system a second wind to process more of that layered history.
On a lighter cultural note, tango from Buenos Aires has danced across the world. It's the sound of the bandoneon, that accordion-like instrument, and the drama of close embrace steps. I play cello, and I love how tango arrangements give the lower strings this smoky, pulsing heartbeat. I keep imagining a streaming series that follows figures like Eva Perón, the First Lady turned social icon, and Che Guevara, the Argentine-born revolutionary in Cuba, not to glamorize, but to really parse their impact at home and abroad. Their arcs map onto so many of Argentina's debates about social justice, leadership, and identity.
Okay, counterfactual time. What if the Congress of Tucumán in 1816 had adopted the Inca plan and crowned a descendant of the Inca as monarch? Imagine a constitutional Andean monarchy. You might get a very different national self-image, one explicitly tied to indigenous heritage at the top. Regional alliances could tilt more toward Andean corridors rather than the Atlantic alone. Maybe Buenos Aires would share symbolic centrality with the Northwest cities linked to pre-Hispanic polities.
I'm picturing cultural policy looking very different. Languages, rituals, and material culture from the Andean world might have received state backing earlier and more robustly. Internationally, a monarchy with Inca lineage could have opened doors with Andean neighbors on a shared civilizational basis, while still navigating Atlantic trade. Would that have cooled the old centralist versus federalist battles? Maybe not entirely, but it might have offered a unifying myth that wasn't just port city-centric.
And economically, if symbols nudged infrastructure priorities, you could see earlier investment in trans-Andean links, maybe shifting some export routes. Whether that beats the gravitational pull of the Atlantic markets is a big question. But as a thought experiment, it's a compelling fork in the road.
Stay curious and keep exploring with us. Until next time on Laid Back Learning with Leah and Garrett.